Well, in our last half hour, we heard from a University of Illinois economist whose research doesn't show much harm being done to ethanol demand from recent small refinery exemptions. However, farm and ethanol groups do not agree with the analysis. Joining us now is Renewable Fuels Association Executive Vice President Geoff Cooper. Thanks so much for joining us, Geoff. Now, what is your response to this recent analysis?
Well, Christina, unfortunately, things are pretty rough in the ethanol market currently, and certainly we are feeling the impacts of these small refiner exemptions. And in fact, just a week or two ago, a University of Missouri study came to a much different conclusion than we saw out of the University of Illinois this morning. The Mizzou study found that if EPA continues to let refiners out of their legal obligations to blend biofuels, we could see $20 billion in demand loss through 2023, and that's about 4.5 or 5 billion gallons of lost renewable fuel blending. So a much different conclusion from Mizzou.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was actually just reading that report from Missouri before coming on. Now, why do you think there's such a discrepancy between what we're seeing there versus the University of Illinois?
Well, I think it all comes down to the assumptions that were made in the Illinois study, and unfortunately we think the author focused on the wrong time period to really examine what's happening in the marketplace. It wasn't really until February or March of this year that the market began to understand the impact and the extent of these small refiner exemptions that EPA had been handing out. And it was really about that same time, February or March, that we saw ethanol blending really begin to decrease. And since then, we've seen blending rates, or the inclusion level of ethanol and gasoline, continue to taper down as refiners kind of kick back with their feet up because they don't have these obligations to blend increasing volumes of renewable fuel.
Well, what's interesting is that the blending rates have decreased, but ethanol prices have also fallen. What do you think is happening there?
That's absolutely right, and that's a piece of this that we think University of Illinois didn't really examine very closely. Is we've seen a 13-year low very recently in ethanol prices. And it's all because the marketplace, ethanol producers, were expecting higher levels of demand, and they produced to meet that demand. And guess what? That demand hasn't been there because of these exemptions. And so we have seen that reflected in much lower ethanol prices. That's negatively affecting profit margins. And in fact, just this last week, we've heard 3 ethanol plants announced they're shutting down. We know of at least a couple more that are throttling back on production. So we are seeing very real impacts of these decisions by EPA in the marketplace today.
Absolutely, and still hoping on that announcement from President Trump sometime soon about year-round sales of E15. RFA Executive Vice President Geoff Cooper, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your perspective.